Welcome to the my first Ghent Workgroup presentation. All you ever wanted to know about transparency, but were afraid to ask. So when we put this webinar together, we actually have triple the attendance that we can handle. So this is obviously a very hot topic. And one of the things about this particular topic is it's very file specific. It's related sometimes to the actual file rather than the process. So what we've decided to do is that, as you can see, on the 19th of May, we are going to have a, I guess you'd call it a panel or a problem-solving webinar, which actually probably is not just related to transparency, but transparency was the topic that kicked it off. And you'll see at the bottom, there's various members of the Ghent Workgroup coming together in a kind of panel, and we will answer your questions in a webinar. You'll need to supply them up front, and you'll need to supply them with files and explanations. And what I'll do is I will just copy this and put it in the chat so you can actually have it. And I'm now being told that we are full. We have our maximum quota of attendees. So quite a few people are going to be disappointed. Okay. A little bit first about the Ghent Workgroup. You obviously know a little bit about us because you registered for the webinar, but it's a group of companies, associations, and users, and we like to call it a cross-section of the graphic arts industry's best minds. There's 4 different types of members. There's the vendor members, and you'll see some familiar companies there. There are the educational members, so these are graphic arts schools and universities. There are the associations, so these are the different national associations. You'll see probably FESPA you recognise, probably Printing Industries of America. If you're based in Belgium like me, then you'll recognise the VIGC and a couple of the others there as well. And then there are companies, so a couple of names there that are probably very familiar to you. Some of the biggest companies in the world, certainly the biggest company in the world, and 1 or 2 others. So it's a real cross-section of the industry. And the goal is to literally be a premier graphic arts think tank. So basically coming together and finding ways to process and standardize basically PDF files, creation and pre-flight. Although it's not limited just to pre-flight and PDF creation, we extend a bit more beyond that. So the goals are basically to improve workflow and give technical information and best practices. Everything we do is free, and we all give our time free. Luckily, we have very understanding employers who let us use our time for this kind of thing. And something you may consider is joining yourself, either your company, or if you're your printing company, or if you're in a university, then talk to your faculty. Various benefits in joining. I won't go through them all. But the bottom line is also very interesting in that we have 3 meetings a year, and you effectively get direct access to the leading companies in this industry. And on a personal level, not only on a technical level, but you get to know people. And of course, that's always very, very useful. If you'd like to participate, you can join as an observer. I've listed our meetings that are coming up. Unfortunately, the next meeting, which is in May in Novi Sad in Serbia, we'll probably do that online. Obviously, it's a bit difficult to travel at the moment, so that will probably be an online meeting. But New York in October, that's at the moment still going ahead, and hopefully will go ahead. February next year in Belgium, and then June next year in Serbia. So if any of those are within distance of you, and you'd like to come and see what's going on, there are 3 days, and you can come for as many days as you want, but you have to apply to be an observer. So if you contact the info email that you would have received from this webinar, then you can come. And you may then, after coming, want to join a subcommittee or even become a member. A little bit about me, not too much about me, but I'm Senior Product Manager at InFocus. I'm responsible for a product called Pitstop. The Ghent Workgroup, I'm also the Technical Officer and co-chair of the Pre-Flight Specifications Committee, along with 2 other people. I'm also a member of ISO, representing Belgium. So it's quite strange being from the UK, but living and working in Belgium and representing Belgium at ISO. My background is I started as a typesetter and then worked for various companies, based either as a vendor or as an actual producer, and then worked as a pre-press manager for several companies in London, and then joined the software business, and then got involved in product management, and then joined InFocus about 10 years ago. A few people I need to thank, because I didn't do this on my own. I needed a few people to run some of the content by. So my fellow co-chair, Peter Kleinheider from Calibrate, I have to thank him for his input, and also 2 of my colleagues at InFocus on the development side, Peter De Bruyne and Ben Schemeth, and also thanks to Mark Lewicki at Adobe for the content he also emailed me. I also want to point out something that may be of interest to you on the Ghent Workgroup website, and that's a document that's produced by Jason Lissel of Ryerson University, and that's a document on transparency best practices. That's a white paper aimed more at the design side than the production side, but nevertheless a lot of very interesting information in there, and that's available now. So quite a lot to get through. What we're going to do, we're going to just talk a little bit about transparency, where it came from, history of it, how it relates to PDFX, PDFX being the graphic arts standard, ISO standard for PDF. Then we'll talk more about transparency itself, about some of the attributes of it, blend modes and blend spaces. Then we'll talk about groups and talk about flattening, and then why you should consider not flattening an application. I know a lot of people still do that. I just want to talk about the benefits of not doing that. And then also talk about pre-flight and a few best practices. In between, there'll be some files. It won't be best by PowerPoint. And the way I've approached this is because literally we could probably talk about transparency all day. It's a very complicated topic, or can be. I'm approaching this from kind of the pre-press operator end and trying to give you an insight into what's happening, where you can look for things, and also a little bit of information about sometimes what might go wrong. So if you've got anything that's specifically file related or problems, then that would be an ideal topic for the webinar in May. So the definition of transparency is it's an effect applied to an object, causing it to appear transparent and letting objects underneath it show through. Now, I'm sure if you're involved in pre-press production, you've got sometimes your own ways of describing it, but that's basically what it is. Now, historically, if we go back and look at the PDF specification, PDF 1.4 was the first version that supported transparency. That was the version that was, at that time, it was still developed by Adobe. It wasn't an ISO standard at that time. And the first version of Acrobat that supported transparency was Acrobat 5. Now you have to remember at that time, all the output rips were actually PostScript based. So the flattening had to be done in the application. You know, if you go back that long, a lot of the workflows were even using separated PostScript, not even composite PostScript. So that's 19 years ago. So transparency has been around for a very long time. In 2002, you got the first RIP that would support it. So Global Graphics with the Harlequin version 6 that had PDF 1.4 support and rendered live transparency. And then in 2006, Adobe rewrote basically from scratch the Adobe PDF print engine, the APPE, and that was released. So that's a native PDF renderer. Before that was also they were using a CPSI, a PostScript rip. If you're working with PDF and talking about standards, then there are different versions of PDFX, PDFX being the version of PDF for the graphic arts industry. Now, most of you, I hope, are familiar with PDFX 1A. That's been around for nearly 19, 20 years as well. That does not allow live transparency. That's based on PDF 1.3 and doesn't support any other color spaces, just CMYK and spot colors. So that's like very, if you like, the bottom end of it. That's the very early stages of working with PDF in print. In 2002, they allowed a new version of PDFX called PDFX 3, which allowed other color spaces to be involved in color management. But that was also based on PDF 1.3. In 2003, there was a revision of PDFX 1, and that was PDFX 1A, 2003. The difference being that was based on PDF 1.4 rather than based on PDF 1.3, but that still required transparency to be flattened. So it's really only with 2008 and PDFX 4 that you had a PDFX version that would allow you to work with live transparency. In other words, the transparency in the PDF was still live and editable, and the handling of it would happen on output. It would not happen in an application. And that's the trends that we see, and that's the trend that the Ghent Workgroup will promote. But of course, if I look at the data that I have from Pitstop, it's now about 50-50 in the market. Half the people using X4, half the people using X1A. So there is a transition in place, but a lot of people still with X1, and hopefully this presentation might go some way to getting you to at least investigate working with live transparency. And what we also have coming is PDFX 6, which is the new PDFX version, which is based on the recently released PDF 2.0 specification. And that's got some differences in the transparency model. There was some ambiguities that were recognized. Now, that's not going to say that what you have now is going to change when you output it with a PDF 2 or PDFX 6 file, but they've just cleared up a lot of the issues that have risen over the years with the specification. So nothing to worry about, but there's some improvements coming. That's not released yet. It's probably going to be sometime the end of this year, early next. Okay. So this is a screenshot from InDesign. And when you're working in InDesign, you can apply a blend mode to an object or a group of objects. And you'll probably recognize those blend modes. They're the same as you see in Photoshop and various other applications. And they change the way that the object interacts with the object underneath it. Okay. So that should be pretty familiar to most of you. And you can see on the left hand of that panel, there's also options for specific functionality for specific things like drop shadows and feathers like that. So you can actually have a feather or a drop shadow and then apply a blending mode to it as well. So for instance, most drop shadows have got multiply, so they interact with the object underneath them. Then we have what's called a blend space. And this is something, I think, where it sometimes goes wrong. And we're going to look at some files in a while, but just to understand what it is. So in a document, you can have a mix of color spaces. You can have RGB and CMYK or LAB, all in the same page, and then they have to be blended together when you flatten or when you output. And the best way to think about this, I think, is to think if you're used to working with Photoshop. In Photoshop, if you've got an image and you're combining 2 or 3 different images together, that last image, that single image, can only have one color space. It can only have one resolution and one color space. This is a very similar thing. The transparency blend space merges all the different content together to make one color space result at the end of it. So this is what's called the transparency blend space. Now that can be CMYK, RGB or RGB, and the Ghent Workgroup recommends that everything uses the same transparency blend space, and you'll see why in the demo file. So it should, from a Ghent Workgroup's perspective, be set to either undefined or device CMYK. If it's undefined, it picks that color space up from somewhere else, whether it's the output or another page group or something like that, which we'll talk about in a minute. But this is something where it goes wrong, and I can show you some examples of that. So you have the document content, which will be your images, your text, your graphics, and then you have your blend space, and then you have your output. So this is when you output the file, you either make it to be a specific color space, or you define it. You normally with an XPFX, you need an output intent, and that would be the output intent. So there can be multiple color conversions going on. Excuse me, just get a quick drink. So also with transparency, you have the concept of transparency groups. Now, if you're familiar with InDesign or Illustrator, you'll know that these can be set. So you have a knockout group, you have an isolated group, and you can have knockout and isolated groups, and you can have everything off. But it's important, I think, to understand what happens in an isolated group and what happens in a knockout group. So in a knockout group, how does it work? Well, in InDesign, you would select a group of objects, you would group them, and then if you then go to your effects, you see this menu where you have those 2 options, which you can see. This one has knockout group selected, and what that means is everything within that group, so think of it as a container, everything within that group knocks out everything else within that group, even if it's set to overprint. Okay, so every object in the group knocks out everything else in the group. An isolated group means that everything in the group stays in the group. So again, it's like a container. And what that means is that things like overprint and blend modes can't leave the group and can't interact with the element underneath. And saying it in words probably doesn't explain it properly, which is why I produce some files. But basically think of it as everything that's grouped in that group is locked in, or locked down, maybe we should say. That's a good word for the moment, is locked in and cannot interact with anything underneath it. Now, the other thing is the group itself, in both cases, in the knockout and the isolated, can have a blending mode of its own. So the actual group container can have a blending mode. And then the last one to talk about, and the only reason I talk about this is that you'll see it when we look at some files, is there's a concept of a page group. Now, this is something that you don't set in InDesign, or the graphic application you're working with, this is something that's created when the PDF is made. This is basically to do with the blend space. And it's the top level, if you like, because there's an enormous amount of color management that goes on or can go on within transparency. And that's one of the places where it goes wrong. And as you'll see here, it says when the blend space is undefined, it gets inherited from the output intent. But if you have an ICC based, so something with an ICC profile attached, then there's color conversions involved, and your pure black, your K, can end up as a 4-color black. Let's look at some files, and hopefully that will explain it in a little bit of detail and give you some examples of what to look for. So let me just hide this. Okay, so this is just a straight page with 4 images in it. One is tagged with Fogra 39. One is an RGB image tagged with Adobe RGB. One is tagged with Japan Color, and the other one is just a grayscale image. Okay. Now, what I've got is I have here the transparency blend space, and you'll see that it's set to, at the moment, to document CMYK. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to export that as a PDFX1A file to the desktop. So there we go. Let's make a PDFX1A, and we'll change the standard to 2003. And just in case somebody was interested, these are the settings. And because it's a PDFX1A, it has to be converted to CMYK. If I change the color conversion to something like do not separate or do not convert, then it won't let me save it as a PDFX1A file, because it has to be CMYK in order to be a PDFX1A. So let's save that. And there it is. In fact, I've named it incorrectly because this is the CMYK version. So let me just fix that. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to change the blend space to RGB. And if you look carefully, you'll see some changes. I don't know if you missed it or if you saw it, but something changed. And what I'll do is I'll save that as RGB. And again, same settings, we'll just export that. And if you have any questions, I see there's a couple of people who've jumped in. Don't be worried if something doesn't make sense, let me know, and I will see if I can do something about it. So bear in mind, the only difference between these two files is the blend space. But what's happened by putting that blend space in there, then what we've done is we've introduced RGB. So the conversion has had to go from CMYK, RGB, or for Fogra 39, Adobe RGB, Japan Color, and Grayscale to RGB, and then back to CMYK for output. So there's been a color conversion within there because the RGB has been inserted in between the content of the file and the output. Now you can obviously see that the two grayscale images look different. If I bring up the the output preview, I'll show you something else as well, because I struggled a little bit actually to find a way to show you that these, what had happened. So what I have here is the ink coverage for this one. And if I click on the RGB one, the ink coverage for this one. And if I put this down the bottom, you can see they're very different. The RGB, not so much, because it's gone from RGB to CMYK, but then understand that the one on the right has gone from CMYK to the blend space, then to the output. So it's gone from CMYK to RGB and then back out to CMYK again. And the result of that, if I call up pit stop, and we do try and be kind of neutral in the Ghent Workgroup, but pit stop's an application I'm very familiar with. So excuse me for using it. So I should just pull up the inspector. So this text here, select it. I have to select it this side. It's 100% K. Yeah, that makes sense. This image here, you can tell it's flattened because you see the atomic regions, the fact that this flattening has sliced the images up into pieces. You can see that is, if I click here, it's a CMYK image, but if I click on the eyedropper, then you can see that it is actually only grayscale. It's only black. It's only a K channel there. If I move across to the RGB file, the one with the RGB blend space, my text is now a 4-color build. And if you look at those values, you can tell that what's happened is that's normally what you would see if you have an RGB black, which has been converted to CMYK, it becomes a 4-color black. Yeah. And if I look at the image at the bottom, again with the eyedropper, you can see now that that is a 4-color black as well. So by having the incorrect blend space in the file, I've caused a color conversion that maybe I didn't want. I certainly didn't want 4-color black, and also not so much on these images, but on other images, that could give you a color shift that would obviously change the result of the file and what it looked like when it appeared on press or on proof. So that's one thing to be aware of, that the blend space is correct. Any questions on that? Someone's just asking about the color management settings. Let me see if I can find those. I think it's just pretty much the Adobe defaults actually. I just maybe changed it to Fogger 39. So that's blend spaces. Okay. Try and be methodical here and close these down. I talked before about groups. And what I've got here is 4 files or 4 pages. And if we look at it in design, this is my group. And if I right click and go to effects, transparency, you can see that the group doesn't blend with the background. So it's not blending with that magenta background, but it's being asked to be a knockout group. And what I'll also do is turn Overprint preview on, because that then gives you maybe a little hint as to what's going on. So this is black text overprinting in a knockout group. This is white text knocking out in a knockout group. This is black text in an isolated group. You can probably already see some differences if you look at the black shadow here versus the black shadow here. And again, if I click here, right click, you'll see the only difference is this is an isolated group. This is the same in a knockout and an isolated group. So that's the combination of the two. Again, just to show you. So the group is isolating and knocking out, nothing for blend mode. So the back is not interacting. Sorry, the group is not interacting with the magenta of the background. And then the fourth page is just a normal page with nothing, no blending, nothing here, and nothing on the isolate or the knockout group. Now, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to export this as a PDF, or in fact, as several PDFs. And then, in fact, no, I'll do it as one PDF. And then what we'll do is we'll look at the result, and that's when it gets interesting. So I'm going to save this as an export this time. So this will be with live transparency. This will not be flattened. And there's my file. Okay. So bear in mind what I said before, that the situation in a knockout group is that everything that's within the group knocks itself out. It knocks through everything. There's no overprint, there's nothing. And if I turn off the black separation, this will maybe give you more of an indication of that. So what do you see? Well, you see that the text that was black overprint is knocking through the yellow and knocking through the cyan, and also it would also knock through anything else in there. The white is obviously knocking out. White is the default, that knocks out all the way through anyway. But what's happening is within this group, everything knocks through the container of the group. Now, in Pitstop, we have a thing called the object browser, which I hope is going to make this a little bit easier to understand. So this is the group container, yeah? So here is my white text. Yeah, the magenta is the thing that's imaged first, and then all the other objects. So in fact, this is slightly reversed. The magenta is the first thing that's painted down onto the page, and the other things come on top. So here you've got all the different aspects of that group, all the things you can see in the yellow boxes. If I click on the form, you see it's selected there, and in Pitstop, I can just come in here and I can see that it's a transparency group and that it's knockout and that it's isolated. Okay, so everything within that group, within this part, knocks through everything else. Okay. If I was to delete this magenta background, you see what happens. It's the magenta background that's giving it the value, giving it the color, nothing else. It's everything in the group knocks through everything else. Now, I also noticed, you notice I've got this Ghent Workgroup logo at the bottom. This is an imported graphic. This is from Adobe Illustrator. And I put this in because I wanted to show you something else as well. If I select that logo, it's in a transparency group. You can see that. It shows you that. There it is. Now you'll notice what the blending space of that transparency group is. It's RGB. If you remember in InDesign, it was set to CMYK. So why has it changed? It's because the imported graphic brings with it its own blend space. So something else to be aware of. It's not just because you configure everything correctly in InDesign that you're going to get an unneeded or unwanted blend space. You also have to be aware of the graphics that are coming into it. And this can be found in pre-flight. This can all be detected, but it's just something else that can go wrong and give you unexpected results. Okay, we're going to leave that form, but I just wanted to bring that in because that's also something important to understand. Okay, so this is the knockout group. Makes sense, I think. Everything within the group knocks out. Let's move to the next page. This is an isolated group. Again, if we click on the page, and I'll bring in the output preview. If you remember what the isolated group does is it keeps everything within it locked inside the group. It doesn't allow it out into interacting with the objects underneath it. So here, for instance, if I turn off the black, you can see it's knocking through the magenta. It's knocking through under the group because the multiply that is on this drop shadow is not getting out of the group. Same as the black overprint. The black overprint that is actually set on this text is not coming out of the group. And you can see that because it's overprinting the yellow. It's also overprinting the cyan here, but that overprint is not being applied to the magenta underneath the group. And that's important because if you need black to overprint, which you typically do, if it's inside that group and it's an isolated group, that's not going to happen. So I don't know if anybody's ever had that problem and tried to make something overprint and everything's set up correctly. The text is set to overprint. It just doesn't work. This could be the reason why. Okay. The third one is both together. So this is both attributes of the last two pages we looked at combined. So what we have here is everything in the group is knocking out everything else in the group, and also as well not interacting with the background. Now these functions, as you can see, they're documented pretty heavily in InDesign and also in Illustrator because designers use them for graphical effects. But if you're trying to diagnose a file or trying to fix a file, this kind of thing, you know, you have to understand it in order to be able to put it right or enable to be able to work with it. Again, if I select it, I could pull in the browser again from Pitstop, and this is my group. This is my transparency group. If I click on the form, again, you can see it knocks out and it's isolated. Of course, I can change that. I can change it here. I could also change the blend space if I want, but that's what's going on here. And then the fourth one, there is no group. Everything is just as you would expect it. There's still a form, but it's not got any attributes. Change that again. I've done the right page. Let me get the right page. There we go. So you've got no groups here at all. You've got a path, which is, that's the magenta. Then you've got the drop shadow. Then you've got the yellow box. Then you've got the drop shadow. Then you've got the cyan. Then you've got the magenta box. And then you've got the black text. Incidentally, while we're here, this is the drop shadow. So this is what happens when you ask for a drop shadow in InDesign. And I think Illustrator's the same. And it's quite interesting to see how these are created, because the way these work is they're actually a black solid with a mask. So it's not a feathered image or anything like that. It's a black solid with a luminosity mask that creates, this is the mask we're looking at here, that creates a soft edge. So in InDesign, of course, you can edit that, you can add additional text and the drop shadow will move and change. But when you export it, that's the way it's created. It's a solid shape, solid color with a mask that creates the drop shadow. Okay, these files, incidentally, will be available. I'll make the InDesign documents. I'm not sure if the PDFs are useful as well, but I'll make the InDesign documents available so so you can have them. Let me now jump back to PowerPoint. So working with transparency, you have to output it. And 19 years ago, when they first released transparency in PDF 1.4, we were all working with PostScript. PostScript doesn't support transparency. So everything had to be flattened, and it had to be flattened in the application. So either within Acrobat or when you exported from, I think even at that time, I'm not even sure you could export, you would print PostScript. So when you flatten in the application, what you're doing, you're trying to preserve the way that the file looks, but at the same time, you have to preserve the content. So in a PDF, you've got text, you've got graphics, you've got images, you've got masks, you've got soft masks, you've got layers, you've got spot colors, you've got overprint. PDF 1.3 doesn't support layers. I just thought I'd get that in there in case anybody tries to pull me up on that. But all this has to be, kept. So that's quite a hefty job if you think about what's going on. And also you get some very weird constructions of PDF, especially if you need to edit them. And I guess one of the classics is that the designer sends a file in and it's got a spot color in it. And you then need to convert that spot color to process, but it's already been flattened. And that can cause particular problems. Now, one of the other things to bear in mind is when you flatten in the application, you're flattening to a resolution, either 300 dpi or to 1200 dpi for line art or things like that. And when you think about when you rip a file, if you let the rip take care of the rendering, because it's actually not flattening when you output to a rip, it's rendering. It's not trying to produce a PDF. What the rip is doing is it's producing effectively four, 5 or 6 separations, which are typically bitmaps, normally TIFF files, but they're at 2540 or they're at a higher resolution. So you're actually going to get a better quality doing it in the rip rather than doing it in the application. And you've not got all of this other stuff to worry about as well. Now, I know that kind of scares a lot of people, but there are people that are doing it successfully, and it is the way to go in the future. And hopefully I'm going to give you enough information in this, or scare you enough about flattening in this presentation to at least make you think about it and maybe even try some things. So when you flatten either on output, you flatten in Acrobat with the flattener preview. What you do is you take all the objects that have got a degree of transparency or deemed to be involved within transparency, and then the application looks at all of those, and then what it does is it cuts the art up, cuts the file up into different regions, each region with its own color. It tries to keep as much of the original file as it can, but because it's not got things like multiply and other things, it's really only got overprint and knockout and masking and things like that. It has to do things to preserve the appearance and preserve the output separations. And it does that by changing the file as it outputs it. So for instance, if you have overprinting in the file, it may change that. It may change overprint into multiply, it may change multiply into overprint. We'll look at some of that in a second. What it also does is it cuts the file up, and this is an example from an Adobe document that I was sent. And you can see what it does. It kind of explodes the document into each of its individual pieces. And you can see that when you look in the wireframe view or you look at the file. This also causes one of the big problems when transparency first started, which is the thin white lines, which I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with. So what causes, or what has to happen to an object in order for it to be included within a flattener? So if it has an opacity of less than 100%, if it's got any kind of blend mode apart from normal, if it's got opacity, if it's got any one of the effects that we saw when we were looking at the panel earlier, the inner glow, the drop shadow, the feather, if you've got any of the strokes with brush or things like that, if it's an image, if you take an image from Photoshop with a transparent background, and if you go back to the days of PostScript, everything had to have a clipping path. That was how you did a cutout. It was a clipping path. Now you can just have a transparent background, but if you do that, it invokes transparency flattening. And also, of course, as you saw earlier, if you place an Illustrator file or any kind of vector file, and it's got any of these transparent features in it, then that's part of flattening. It could also be part of flattening if it's close to another object that has transparency, or if it's overlapped by it. So if it comes into play, then it can be flattened as well. So as I mentioned before, what happens is that the file is cut into pieces, and this is a good example. This is obviously one image with some white text on it, some black text on it, a logo on it. But the text residency isn't what it used to be. That's got a drop shadow on it. You can't see it very well, but it is there. It's a very faint one. And the presence of that drop shadow means that it has to be flattened. And you can see in the middle image what's happened. It's been sliced into these different atomic regions. And sometimes and it caused a lot of consternation in the design community. You would see very thin white lines appear between the different atomic regions, and that's due to anti-aliasing and the difference between the images. Typically they wouldn't print, although to say they would never print is probably a bit of a big statement. And again, Acrobat's got some functionality for improving that from a viewing point of view. But in the early days of transparency, that was a big problem. So if you have overprint mixed with transparency flattening, and I'm just looking at the time, we're going to be a little bit over, but I'll try and whisk through it. If you have overprint involved in areas which are involving transparency as well, then that overprint will be pre-processed and can change. But what I draw your attention to is the bottom line. Never ever use the discard overprint option when you're working with transparency, because it's integral, it's part of the way that files are constructed in order to achieve the correct effect. Spot colors. I know that some people worry a lot, or used to worry a lot, when spot colors are involved in transparency. If it doesn't work, it's something to do with the configuration. There are some cases where certain blend modes can't be used, but you'll see that the difference should be obvious. Fonts. Well, you've seen the options probably in the flattener. Very often those need to be outlined or converted to an image because of the way that the transparency is working. So you have to be careful that some objects or some pieces of text are rendered to an image and others aren't, because then you'll see a difference. There'll be a difference, a step between the two. So one of the recommendations in the document that I mentioned at the beginning from Jason, the best practices, is that the object stack, the one that you saw when I went into pit stop, the stack of objects that are on top of each other, try and put the text and line art above the transparency so that it doesn't become involved within the flattening process. Now, obviously that's not always possible. It depends very much on the design, but that would be a goal if you can do it. Of course, not everybody's got time to do that, so it's best done at the start by the designer, but as we all know, sometimes that doesn't always happen. So I mentioned before about working with live transparency and not flattening in the application. And this is something that we've done quite a lot of work on at the Ghent Workgroup, especially with regards to working with PDFX4. So these are the benefits that we see for working with live transparency, is that the quality is higher, basically because you're working at the device of the output unit. So if you're working on a CTP device, you may be outputting at 2,500 dots per inch. If you're flattening an application at 300, then obviously it's not going to be quite the same quality. So objects aren't clipped, images aren't clipped. You can edit the file. That's obvious, I think. You don't get any outline text or object conversions. The file can be color managed. So you're not in a situation where the color management has already taken place and objects have been converted to images. You've still got the ability to modify things, and you keep your spot colors till the very end. You can still search the document, and I guess as well, you don't get any viewing issues. You don't get that anti-alias effect with the thin lines, and you don't have to rely so much on Acrobat Reader for the overprint simulation. The other thing is it's faster to export from the native application, because you're not generating all these images and this rasterizing isn't taking place. And also you get smaller files. That's pretty obvious, or maybe not so obvious. Let's have a look at some files, and also we'll dive in and look at some output. because I find sometimes the constructions that you get from flattened files are very interesting. So what I've got here, I've got 3 pages, and I've marked up what's happening. So here we've got a CMYK image with a transparent background, and it's on 100% magenta, and it's just got a normal blend mode. So if I just come into here, you can see there's nothing going on. It's just a straight image with a transparent background from Photoshop on a magenta background. This is exactly the same, except that it's on a spot color. So the background here is Rubine red, so it's a spot color. This one is exactly the same as the previous file, with one exception. It has a drop shadow. It should have a drop shadow. Well, you can see it's got a drop shadow. And this one as well. This has a drop shadow as well. So black drop shadow, multiplied blend mode going over the background, and the same here. And this last one is very interesting as well. This is a duotone, Rubine red and black. And again, in this case, it's on magenta. And in this case, it's on the spot color. And I'm just looking at the questions and seeing if there's anything I need to address. No, just a comment from Jochen. Hi, Jochen, somebody I know. Just saying that the white lines I talked about, you will see on some digital printers. So we're just coming up to the hour. I know this was scheduled to be an hour, but I'm in lockdown, so I've got a bit of time, and I hope you have as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to call this car, and we'll start off by saving it as a PDFX4, just to the desktop. And I'm going to create separate files for it, and it's an X4. There we go. All pages, and there we are. I'll just let that finish. And now I'm going to do exactly the same, but make them PDFX1. So in other words, flatten the transparency. So there we go. And there we are. We'll export that. I forgot to click separate files. So we'll just wait for that to finish. Let's just get rid of that. X1, save, separate files, export. Now bear in mind, this is not a particularly dramatic or a particularly large file, but nonetheless, it shows what I want to show. So there's the X1. There's the X4. You can hopefully straight away see the difference in file size. 1.5 meg for the X1 versus under a megabyte. Here, just under a meg for 1.5 meg, and 1.1 meg, 1.3 meg. So yeah, the X1 is larger simply because it's got more image content within it. Let's look at the 2 files. So I'm just going to close some real estate, and then this one I'm going to drag over here. So I'm going to look at the wireframe. Again, I'm using pit stop here to look at the wireframe. The one on the right is obviously the X1 file. You can see the atomic regions and the way it's been sliced up. Now, bear in mind this has a transparent background. So how's that been achieved when we've flattened? Let's try and resolve what's going on. So if I click, and I just wanted my pit stop inspector. And also what I'll do is I'll pull in the thing I used before, the object browser. So if you look here, you can see without too much difficulty that the file's been sliced up into pieces, whereas if I look at the unflattened version, it's pretty straightforward. There's my background, there's my other background, there's an image, and there's my text. Okay, so nothing really has changed there. On this side, you can see that it's in pieces. So let's see what's going on. So I'm going to click and look at the individual elements and then see what's happened. So let's click here. So I have a full out background magenta image. I can see that. I'm going to delete that. Let's get rid of it. And you see within it, I've got another image. And I'm going to delete that. So you can see what's happened is it's combined that background image with the magenta and literally just made a single, well, not single, but multiple single images out of the page. Okay, and if I move it, you can see it's got a clip mask because as I'm moving the image within a clip mask, the clip mask is staying. Okay, so I think that's pretty straightforward. Now, if we move to the bottom, bear in mind the one at the bottom is sitting on a spot color. Okay, so I have my, let's pull up the inspector and we can see what's going on. Now the inspector is telling me that this, if I click on the car here, it's rubine red. Okay, and if I look at the browser, so this is the object stack, these are all the objects, you can see it is actually rubine red. So if I delete it, it's the first object is a rubine red object which has got a white hole in it, and you can see that here in the object browser. Now what's happening there is it's overprinting. If I make it knockout, that's what the image looks like. So that's the image, the spot color image with a hole in it, with a white hole, overprinting the CMYK image beneath it. Now, say this is wrong. Say this should be CMYK. What do I do? So of course, there's various ways of editing PDF files. So here, if I say I want to convert that rubine red to CMYK, it converts it. But the problem with doing it is that CMYK will not overprint CMYK. That's one of the laws of PDF. It won't do it. It will have to have that white hole. So if I want to merge those two again, the only way to do it, strangely enough, is to give it a blend space. So there I've got the CMYK object blending with the CMYK object. So you can see the way this file has been put together. It's all of these magenta shapes that are coming together. Let's revert that and go back to the original. It's a series of Rubine red, overprinting the CMYK image, and that gives us the 5-color result we're looking for. Now there's one other one that because I don't want to waste too much time, spend too much of your time. This one is the drop shadow. That's a similar thing. That's the X1. That's the X4. So you can see at the top, again, if I wireframe, the X4 is quite straightforward. The flattened one is a little bit more complex. Again, you can see the atomic regions. So how's this constructed? Well, here you've got, pick the right tool. Here you've got an image. And what I'll do is I'll do what I did last time. I'll delete the magenta at the background. So what you've actually got here is just a CMYK image. Which has merged the drop shadow and the magenta background into the images to give the result that we need. If we look at the bottom with the spot color, again, I'm expecting to get a similar result to what we just saw with the other file. So again, I've got a spot color, I've got a Rubine red, and if I get rid of it, you can see it's overprinting as before. And let's get rid of all of that. And we can see how it's handling the drop shadow. Yeah, so the drop shadow here, the drop shadow and the car have been merged into one image, and then the spot color overprints. And that's what gives the knockout of the car and the black shadow sitting on. So it's simply just using overprint and knockout and masks. And the last one, I think, is probably the most interesting. So this is a duotone, and the duotone is black and Rubine red. Let me show you that by pulling up the output preview. And we can just turn so there you go. So that's just a duotone with transparent background from InDesign. Again, sitting on a magenta background at the top and on a spot color background at the bottom. So if I click here, what do I get? I get indexed on N channel. So I actually have a duotone here. And let's see what it is. We'll delete it. And this is, now this is the X4 file. I'm getting myself confused. This is the X4. So yeah, that's what you'd expect. That's a duotone, because this is live transparency, a duotone just sitting on a magenta background, And here, same again, just an image sitting on a background. So nothing too spectacular there, nothing really to see. It gets a little bit more interesting with the X1 file. Again, you can see it's divided up into atomic regions, as you'd expect from a flattened file. But then how's it being constructed? That's always the interesting part. So what we have here is we have Pantone Rubine red separation. And I'll do the same as I did before. I'll lose the background. And then we're into images. So this is a Pantone Rubine red spot color. And if it's anything like the last one, it overprints. You can see that. If I delete it, you'll see that what it's done is the duotone that I had as a single image, it's actually separated it into two separate images. It's now two images. It's this one, which is the spot color, and it's this one, which is the CMYK. So quite interesting. It's made two images out of it. That's the way it's flattened it, but also managed to keep the duotone effect. Now the bottom one, let's have a look at that. If I click here, this is the Pantone Rubine red. Again, overprinting. You can see it's overprinting here. If I delete that, and I'll get rid of the tint as well, you can see it's actually combined those two together, and that is a device N, but if I look what it is, it's actually black only. So if I take the eyedropper just to show you that. You see it's actually just black. So a few questions. So do most modern rips handle X4 correctly? Yes, they should do. If they're there's lots of, I think we could probably agree that there's two main graphic arts rips, and then there's a few other ones as well. I'll show you something in a while as I finish off, which will be very interesting for you if you want to test what's going on in your workflow. Mohammed's saying, what is the output related problems due to transparency? Well, that's why I say we could probably spend a whole day on this topic. If you have any, you can send them in for the next webinar, but it's bad configuration, bad design, and incorrectly configured software and output devices. I think that's probably fair to say it. And what's the exact danger of importing a transparency group with RGB blend space in InDesign? What's the worst that can happen is that you get an unexpected color shift. So if you know what you're doing and you're doing it correctly and you understand what's happening, then it shouldn't be a problem. But if it happens and you don't know it's there, then of course you can get color shifts, and then once the job's delivered, you get a very unhappy customer because he's not got what he expected. Question about APPE transparency problems. Now we're getting very specific. Let me show you, seeing as a lot of the questions now are about ripping, let me continue with the PowerPoint, and maybe that will give you some answers. But again, if there's anything specific you want to know, send files into the next webinar in May with the links I gave you at the beginning, and you can get answers from our little panel of experts on exactly what's going on. Okay, so checking transparency excuse me, is very important. As you can see, there's lots of things that can catch you out. and sometimes, especially in today's market where you're dealing with lots and lots of files and there's no real time to look at them and to diagnose them properly, things can go wrong. So the top line, make sure your current pre-flight routine includes the relevant checks to ensure that transparency is configured properly. Of course, if you're getting flattened files, then the damage is already done and there's not much you can do. You can just print them, or maybe, as you saw, you can edit them. If you're getting live files, then you've got more of a chance because you can actually get in and start to edit things. As far as the Ghent Workgroup is concerned, our profiles appear in all the major pre-flight applications and also in most of the modern RIPs, because of most of the modern workflows, because our members are those companies that deal with those people like Kodak and Agfa and Ricoh and Osei and Canon. They're all companies that deal with the Ghent Workgroup, as well as Pitstop, Aim Focus and Calus. These are all companies that support and test the Ghent Workgroup profiles. So these applications have got the profiles within them. Now, the Ghent Workgroup 1v4 specification, that's from 2008, so that's 11 years old. That is based on PDFX1A. That will flag if the file contains transparency, simply because it's not allowed to. If you want to deal with live transparency, then either the 2012 or probably more likely the 2015 specifications will be of use to you. And there's a small typo there, I should have an X there. The PDFX4, so they're based on PDFX4. And there's two particular checks that are included within those pre-flight specifications. One is the check that the transparency blend space is CMYK. So that's not going to matter if it's in InDesign or in an imported graphic, as you saw at the beginning, that will be flagged up. And then the other one is if you're working with PDFX, which these are based on, it will flag if the output intent is not CMYK. In fact, the 2012 was a bit more specific because it actually defined specific ICC profiles that should be used as output intents. But they're all available in the applications, and you can look and you can test with them. What is also extremely useful, especially as most of you are talking about RIPs now, is the Ghent Output Suite. And this is something that has been around for a few years and has been improved and developed, and will be improved and developed again as PDF2 becomes available. This is a series of free test pages with full documentation that you can get from the Ghent Workgroup site. And what happens is these are just two patches, the two relevant patches for blend modes. Basically, you output these files, not just in your RIP, but through your whole workflow, because within your workflow, you have certain other applications. And some of these applications will rewrite or will change a PDF file. And they could be doing the damage before they even get to output. So this checks the whole of your production workflow. Not the pre-flight though, because these files are not built to test pre-flight. They're actually, some of them are hand built, because what happens, as you can see on the bottom right hand side, if the files come out incorrectly, these patches will have a cross through them. So they'll flag up which of these PDF constructions your particular workflow or output device has got problems with. So they're very, very useful for going back to your support team or to your manufacturer saying, hey, your RIP is not doing this, your product is not doing this. How do I configure it so it does? So somebody talked about Prinergy before. If you look at this, you will see on the Ghent Workgroup site a whole list of vendors who publish the configurations for how your RIP should be configured to correctly process these files. So people like EFI and Kodak and ESCO have all published fact sheets and data sheets on how things can be configured. But they're a very, very useful way of checking your workflow and your output devices and making sure that they're set up correctly. And that was it. So how are we doing for time? So we're about 20 minutes over schedule, but I hope that was useful. It wasn't designed to be completely technically deep. It was designed to at least hopefully give you the information about the way that transparency works, what could be going wrong, and some ideas of how you can test it, fix it. And also in the next webinar, which I'll give you the information on before, you have another vehicle where you can submit specific files that are giving you problems, and we can then, as a group, analyze them and give you some feedback. So let me come into the chat. Oh, it's already in the chat window, but there it is again. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for your time. You should all go and wash your hands now, and stay safe, and hopefully we will see you in May, and look forward to speaking to you again then. Thank you very much.